So in the last video, I was talking a bit about the problem of noticing, this problem of, how do you pick out the relevant bits of whatever you're looking at? How do you see what's interesting in the messy complexity of the world? And what I finished off with suggesting was that in science, one of the ways that we solve the problem of noticing, at least temporarily, is by having a paradigm. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what paradigms are and how they help to structure scientific research, what they can do for us, and the ways in which, in some sense, they limit us. But I really do think that this is the limitations are almost a feature rather than a bug. Okay, so this word paradigms, in the way I'm using it, comes from this book. This is a super famous book in history and philosophy science, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. So Kuhn argues for a picture of the history of science in which most research in a mature discipline is conducted within a paradigm, what he calls a paradigm, a paradigm is a kind of way of doing science. If the shortest version of explaining what a paradigm is a way of pursuing a particular discipline. So what that means in a little more elaborately is a paradigm is a set of theoretical beliefs, sort of theories. It's a set of experimental methods, and it's a set of ways of evaluating evidence. So what counts, once you've done an experiment, what counts as a good experiment? What would count as good evidence for some theory within that paradigm? So these collections of theories and experimental methods and standards of evidence altogether constitute a paradigm. And Kuhn's picture of the history of science is that almost all science, 99% of it, happens within some paradigm or other, where a community of scientists agree on some basic theoretical foundation, not like the complete elaborate details, but some basic theoretical outlines, some experimental methods that go with those outlines to kind of fill in the details, and some set of standards of evidence by which you can judge the experimental results that are rolling in. Okay, so a paradigm in this sense is a way of picking out what's interesting and important to investigate in some area. And in that sense, it's a kind of temporary solution to the problem of noticing, right? So if you know where to look, what you're looking for, and what it would look like to be successful in finding it, that's a kind of, it's a set of guiding principles about what you should be noticing in some field. Okay, so if you want a picture of what it would look like to work on science without a paradigm, so later in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the problems that paradigms cause us, and you might be tempted at that point to say, oh, what if we just did without paradigms? Well, we have some pretty good historical cases of what that looks like. So, for example, consider alchemy. So alchemy is the kind of thing that happened before chemistry. It looks a lot like chemistry in the sense that you're taking samples of various substances and you're reacting them together and you're distilling them and doing various quite chemistry-looking operations on them. But alchemy didn't have a paradigm in the way that modern chemistry does. So a paradigm involves things like a shared set of language, so shared taxonomy or nomenclature for the different things that you're working in. In alchemy, different alchemists tended to have different names for things. They didn't share a precise set of methods or a precise set of standards of evidence. So what counts as a good alchemical experiment differs from alchemist to alchemist. So alchemy did produce a whole bunch of really interesting results. They learned how to do a bunch of practical things that eventually did lead into the modern practice of chemistry. But the way they organized their community was not on the basis of a consensus set of beliefs about what they were doing, which means that if one alchemist discovers something interesting, it's very hard for other alchemists to sort of translate that into their own framework. And very often alchemists tried to make this hard on purpose. So they would write their alchemical treatises in a kind of coded language. They would say things like, the green lion eats the sun to bring forth the conjunction of the king and queen. And what they might mean by that is something like, this acid dissolves this metal, which then can be used for something else. but they put it in a kind of code to protect their secrets, which is pretty much the opposite of the way that modern scientists do it. Modern scientists do their best to put things in a common language to make it as clear for other people as possible. Now, as I said, alchemy did produce a lot of interesting results, but it produced them really slowly. Like over centuries, it produced some quite interesting results. Compare that to modern chemistry, where there's a shared set of language and a shared basic theoretical framework that everybody's working in. So when you do something in one laboratory, maybe you find an interesting result in your laboratory, when you share that with the rest of the chemistry community, they know what it means, right? Because you're working in the same theoretical structure, they can understand the significance of what it is that you found. Furthermore, because you're all working with the same paradigm, you're looking at things that are probably going to be relevant to what other people are looking at. So you have a shared set of beliefs about what the interesting or important experimental results would be. So because you've got this shared language, this shared set of beliefs about what would be important, what's worth noticing, and what counts as a good experiment. So the community of chemists also share standards of evidence. So, if you're running a chemistry experiment and you describe your methods, if you've got something like really weird and wacky going on in your methods, other chemists can pretty quickly say, yeah, that's not how we do it in chemistry. Whereas in alchemy, it's really hard to compare. So because chemists are working within a shared paradigm, they're able to communicate their results very, very effectively. So you massively reduce the kind of, you might say, the friction involved in communicating results. Results can be communicated effectively, efficiently. You're speaking the same language. And furthermore, you're much more likely, if you're working with other people in the same paradigm, to produce results that are going to be interesting or important to them, that they can use and build off of, so that you're cooperating effectively. Your results help them produce better results, and their results help you produce better results. So once you get a science in a paradigm, it looks like, you can sort of follow this through the history of science. When you get everybody on the same page in terms of theories, methods, and standards, progress seems to take off. Like, it really rapidly accelerates. It's vastly more efficient to have a whole bunch of people working within a paradigm than to have everybody kind of on their own page, roaming around, trying whatever they feel like. So that's what a paradigm can do for you. If you recall this example from last time, Grinnell gave us a nice example of what you might call like a little micro paradigm. So Grinnell hopped from one set of problems and to another. So he hopped from looking at rat liver metabolism of citric acid to looking at cell adhesion, and those are much smaller than the broad paradigm that structures all of cell biology. All of cell biology shares a bunch of beliefs and assumptions, like the cell is the basic organization of life, or that DNA codes for proteins. These are kind of like central to the whole discipline. But when Kuhn is talking about paradigms, he says that there can be like large-scale paradigms and also little paradigms within those. So within, for example, the experimental people working on cell adhesion, there's going to be some set of standards and beliefs and methods and that kind of thing. So, you can have big paradigms and you can have little paradigms embedded within them. Okay. So when Grinnell makes this switch, he switches from one research program to another. One of the reasons he's able to do this, I think, as I described last time, is because there was already a paradigm for him to hop into, right? So there's a set of beliefs and experimental methods and standards of evidence for him to sort of shift over to. It's much, much harder to carve out your own mini paradigm than it is to hop into one that already exists. Okay, so let me just give you a couple examples of paradigms, show you what they do for us and some of the limits of paradigms. So Here's a really classic one. So Newtonian Mechanics, classic paradigm. And it makes a bunch of assumptions. So when you adopt a kind of Newtonian mechanics picture, it comes with a bunch of assumptions about what nature is like. So, for example, the assumption in Newtonian mechanics is that nature can be described mathematically. So that's actually a departure from previous ways of doing physics. Aristotelian physics, that was dominant in the West for like a very long time, rejected the idea that mathematics can describe nature. The idea was that nature is just too messy and complicated for mathematics to tell us anything important about it. With sort of Galileo and the people that lead up from Galileo to Newton, we get this acceptance that no, nature, you can do physics using math. So one of these deep assumptions, one of these deep beliefs. So assumptions suggest it happens without evidence. It's a sort of theoretical commitment of Newtonian mechanics. Other commitments include the idea that space and time kind of stay stable, right? Space and time are just there. They are the theater in which objects move and change, but space and time themselves just sort of sit there. And furthermore, all observers of events inside of space and time should, if they're observing properly, agree on things like how massive an object is, or its size, or its velocity, or the order in which things happen. And these are both theoretical assumptions and standards of evidence for looking at experiments. So inside the Newtonian paradigm, if you have two different observers reporting two different, say, velocities, relative velocities for an object, or they observe an object to have different mass, you're just going to say there's something wrong with these observations, right? If two different observers come up with different numbers for what's going on inside space and time, one of them's just got to be wrong. So you can use these assumptions not just as theoretical posits, but as ways of evaluating new evidence. And I point this one out in particular because famously there's a paradigm shift around the beginning of the 20th century from Newtonian mechanics to the theory of relativity. So the theory of relativity makes a different set of assumptions which come with different standards of evidence. Now, a lot is shared between Newtonian mechanics and relativity. For example, they both are perfectly happy with the idea that nature can be described mathematically. Both theories are mathematical theories about physics. But in relativity, there's a rejection of the idea that space and time are, in some sense, unaffected by what goes on inside of them. So space-time is warped by the gravitational attraction of objects, for example. And furthermore, in relativity, it gets its name for the idea that things are observer relative. So if you've got one observer sitting here still and one observer zooming away from them near the speed of light, those two observers are going to, even if their observations are perfect from their own perspective, they're going to disagree on things like how heavy things are, or how fast they're happening, or how large they are. So whereas in the Newtonian standard, in the Newtonian paradigm, differences like that would be evidence that somebody's observing wrong. In the relativistic paradigm, that's perfectly fine. I mean, it can just be objectively the case that two observers observing the same thing are going to disagree. So that's a big classic kind of paradigm shift in the history of science. These are the big, large-scale paradigms. These aren't little micro paradigms. Okay, so think back a little to the last video and the stuff about insight problems. So the point of that was basically that the assumptions that you make, the kind of framework that you're looking at the world through, are going to shape what you see, what you notice. So, and that's good in the sense that you're always working with less time, energy, and processing power than you maybe want. So you have to come to the world with assumptions. You can't just come to the world raw and take it all in. It's simply not possible. But it does, in some sense, limit us. So by operating with theoretical sort of frameworks, by operating with standards of evidence or accepted sets of experiments, it does limit what you can see. This is, in my opinion, a helpful limitation, but it is one that occasionally holds us back. And that's why Kuhn thinks we need to sometimes have paradigm shifts or scientific revolutions. So I think this is why I've shown this image when I've been talking about paradigms. I think binoculars are a really good metaphor for what a paradigm does for you. So if you're looking through binoculars, you can see much, much further than with your unaided eyes, right? You can see clearly things very far away that you wouldn't be able to see. So you can see further, you can see more clearly, but they also limit the scope of your vision, right? So when you're looking through binoculars, you can't see as much on the periphery as when you're just looking with your eyes unaided. So they let you see more in one sense and less in another sense. So here's an example where I think the research kind of benefited from breaking out of its paradigm a little bit. Here's another broad paradigm, this time from psychology. So for most of the 20th century, the dominant paradigm, it wasn't the only one, but the dominant paradigm of research in psychology was what's called behaviorism. So behaviorism puts a very specific set of limits on what counts as a good observation, as a worthwhile observation. And what they were rejecting is what's called the introspectionist tradition, where people were doing psychology by asking people to just sit there and reflect on your experience. Tell me about your inner experience. And the behaviorists thought, this is too messy and difficult, and they would say subjective, to count as good science. So what they wanted was things that are publicly cross-checkable, right? So it needs to be the case, the behaviorists thought, that more than one person can make the observation in order to reduce potential individual biases, which is, that doesn't sound super unreasonable as a standard of evidence, right? So they also had, in that vein, they also believed that a good experiment would basically be tying a stimulus to a response. And all this messy internal stuff, because brain scans weren't great at the time, like they didn't have really good MRI scanners or that kind of thing. So a theory in psychology for them constituted a way of relating stimulus, something that happens to your senses, and response, something that you do behaviorally. And because they were trying to study the stimulus-response relationship as precisely as possible, they thought the thing to do would be to strip away all of the kind of complex environmental stuff so that you get the pure stimulus and the pure response. Okay, so that's the kind of behaviorist, this is very, very rough, but that's the short version of what the behaviorist paradigm was like. So now let's look at what that looks like in the context of addictions research. So for most of the 20th century, addictions research, so drug addiction, was studied in this behaviorist paradigm. So what they wanted to do was study the effect, the response of various drugs, which are the stimulus. So you give the subject some stimulus, which is either a drug or a choice between, say, drugs and food or something like that, and you see what their behavior is. And you want to isolate that stimulus response relationship. So you want to make the environment as simple as possible. And what that meant largely was studying animal subjects, often rats, and you would keep the rats in these little bare metal cages. And they would do things like, so to study the addictions cycle, what they would do is, for example, give the rat a choice between, they say, okay, rat, you can have some morphine-laced water or some food. And the rats very often, or typically, or a lot of the time, would go straight to the morphine. Give them morphine or cocaine or something like that. So rats would, in these little bare metal cages, choose the drug over the food so often that they'd starve. It was very sad. And the conclusion that people drew from this was these drugs are so powerful, they rewire your brain to such an extent that you will starve rather than give up any of the drugs. So therefore, these drugs are just, you should just like, they're so awful that you should never go anywhere near them. I mean, they are super dangerous. You shouldn't do these drugs. But the belief was that it's just so brain rewiring that nobody can safely use them. But that's a weird conclusion to come to, since they were being medically prescribed a lot of the time. So if you go in for surgery, they would still be giving you opiates. And most of the people who went in for surgery, they would have opiates for post-surgery pain management, and then they wouldn't go on to be addicted to opiates. So what's going on here? A researcher in the 1970s called Bruce Alexander did an experiment which kind of tried to get outside of the behaviorist paradigm. So he's questioning some of their assumptions about what counts as a good experiment. And his experiment was called Rat Park. So he got some rats addicted to morphine, I believe, like a strong opiate, morphine-laced water in the standard way. So you start off with the standard behaviorist paradigm, get them quite addicted to morphine. But then some of them he released into this little, you can see an image there here of a little space filled with wood chippings and little cans that they can hide in, and maybe most importantly, other rats. So rats are highly, highly social animals, and they get quite distressed, like humans do, if they don't get to interact with other of their species. So when he introduced rats into this more normal for them environment, so imagine going from a bare metal cage to a space where you can move around and explore, interact with other members of your species, hide, that kind of thing. What he found was that the rats used way, way less of the morphine, sometimes as much as 19 times less of the drug. They would seem to prefer actually water unlaced with the drug. So you give them the option of water laced with morphine and a little sugar because the morphine is bitter, or just plain water, and they prefer the plain water. So these rats seem to rehabilitate themselves. They put themselves through opiate withdrawal voluntarily as soon as you put them into an environment that's kind of less horrible than a bare metal cage where you're completely isolated. So, okay, so caveat here, just a little warning. This is a controversial study. People criticize his methodology. Further researchers tried to replicate it and had some trouble. For our purposes, the question isn't whether this was just completely unambiguously true. What I want you to think about here is just the ways in which the behaviorist paradigm suggested a set of experimental procedures and standards of evidence that might have been limiting what we can learn and understand about the subject that they were trying to study. So, I mean, I take it that they had some pretty good reasons for thinking about psychology in the way that they thought about it. They wanted to get rid of the kind of messy, subjective, introspective stuff, but that line of thought led them to a type of experiment that probably deeply distorted the subject that they were trying to study. So current addictions research focuses quite a lot more on the environment that you're in. So if you have a person in a kind of, I mean, people in happy, healthy social networks with family and friends who are supportive have way, way better outcomes in addictions treatment than people who are socially isolated and traumatized. So thinking about it in terms of just the chemical properties of the drug seems to have been insufficient to understand the process that we're looking at. Okay, so again, for our purposes, I mean, the scientific controversy continues. I'm not trying to advocate for one side of it or the other here. But what I'd like you to notice is that the paradigm allowed everybody to be on the same page, to pull in the same direction, which makes research more efficient. like the binoculars, it let you see much further than you would have unaided by any paradigm at all. But it can also exclude things from view, right? It can also make things that are actually important not appear within your scope of vision. So that's why paradigms are at best a temporary solution to the problem of noticing. So a paradigm sharpens up your focus on some limited thing, but it is often the case, and throughout the history of science this has happened over and over again, we need to shift paradigms, hopefully to something more encompassing that captures what was good about the last one, but also captures more and more interesting phenomena, more of what's relevant in your area of study. So Grinnell gives us a nice example of the ways in which paradigms help to distinguish what he calls noise and data. So the data, the relevant stuff, the ones that you're trying to, the world is this big complex mess and you're trying to focus in on the data. But the line between noise and data is shifting, right? So it depends on the paradigm, the framework that you're approaching the world will determine what counts as noise and what counts as data. So recall his new project. He's working on cell adhesion, what makes cells stick together. And he started this process by just counting the number of cells that stuck to the petri dish under various conditions. So the number of cells that were stuck were his data. And things like what the cells look like were just irrelevant. They were just kind of noise, right? You look through that, you look past it, you don't pay attention to it. But as he developed this project, as he got better and better at it, he did some teaching about it, so that makes you think hard about something. He collaborated with some people who were really good at taking pictures of cells in a petri dish, so his pictures got way, way better. He started paying attention to the shape of the cells rather than just their number. And what he found was that the shape of the cells was giving him better information about cell adhesion than just counting the number that stuck to the petri dish. So now the number of cells that stuck was kind of irrelevant. That becomes, in some sense, noise or background noise, whereas the shape becomes data. So originally, number is data, shape is noise. Once he develops in this paradigm something that was noise, the shape becomes the data. So there's this very interesting shifting relationship between noise and data as your paradigm grows and develops. And this sometimes happens gradually. It sometimes happens in these very small ways. So Grinnell's example is in some sense a little micro paradigm shift. And it sometimes happens in more dramatic ways. Now, Kuhn talks mostly about the large-scale dramatic paradigm shifts. And when there is such a shift, so the one that I talked about in this lecture was the shift from Newtonian mechanics to relativity, or Newtonian mechanics to quantum mechanics. The shift is a shift in community structure and standards, right? So it's not just that one person discovers that, oh, relativity is the best way to go. You have to convince the entire scientific community that relativity is going to be better than Newtonian mechanics. So this paradigm shift is a kind of community level event. It's something that happens within a whole scientific community rather than just one person's head. And a lot of people were worried when Kuhn's book came out that what he was saying, in effect, is that a paradigm shift is a kind of popularity contest, right? So because the consensus, what makes a paradigm really powerful, is that everybody's on the same page. That's what helps the scientific community cooperate effectively. But that means that you have to convince your whole community to shift paradigms with you. And people thought this sounded like Kuhn saying, oh, this makes science just one big popularity contest. Now, or a matter of, sometimes they say, mob psychology. Now, I don't think he was saying this. I think if you read this book carefully, I don't think Kuhn was saying this at all. But what I do think Kuhn rightly brings up is the community dimension of how paradigms are agreed upon and how they change over time. So that's what we're going to shift to talking about next week. So in this two conversation model that Grinnell develops, The credibility cycle is a relationship between the individual and the research community, and that's where paradigm shifts happen, when you convince some broader community to change the way that they're doing things. Okay, so that's what we'll do next week, is the credibility cycle. Thanks.